You might recall our Bloomberg exclusive. We talked about this yesterday. The U.S. Slowing AI chip exports to the Middle East by NVIDIA and AMD. We also recently reported on how ASML and TSMC could disable their chip machines if China invaded Taiwan. There's more.
Another Bloomberg exclusive. Mm-hmm. We should note that also the U.S. spending big time, thanks to the CHIPS Act, to build chip making here at home, too, as our nations around the world to fortify their supply chains. China, too, Carol, creating a nearly $50 billion chip fund to back its own domestic semi-industry firms.
There's a lot going on. With more on the oh-so-important world of semiconductors, with us, Michelle Giuda, CEO of the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. She is former Assistant Secretary of State for Global Public Affairs.
Look, the United States has a long-term plan to lead and compete in semiconductors and critical technologies, and so does China and other authoritarian regimes. And so I would expect a lot of consistency in whatever the future U.S. administration is going to be in terms of the U.S. prioritizing chips. As you had mentioned earlier, Tim, the CHIPS Act is a first move in really trying to catalyze U.S.'s ability to manufacture, to lead in R&D, and to work with many of our allies and partners in order to do so. So I expect that to be a long-term priority for the United States.
I'm wondering about how you think about China in terms of it being a threat when it comes to semiconductors. Certainly, we see the way that the U.S. government thinks that it could be a threat with the use of U.S. semiconductors. But if you think that China is a threat when it comes to its own semiconductors.
China has been very clear. Xi Jinping has been very clear that China wants to lead and compete and achieve self-sufficiency in semiconductors. And the big picture is, why do semiconductors matter? It's because they matter to anything that has an on and off switch. So that's regular everyday consumer products, but it's also the most advanced military products. And so it matters to us and it matters to them. And they want to be able to have the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing and capabilities worldwide in order to advance all of their strategic interests, which in many cases are antithetical to our own. And so they've prioritized it. This $48 billion that they've recently, this round of funding that they're putting into semiconductors is actually just a freeze frame of their longer term plan. It's actually $140 billion, a 10-year plan. There is a chip czar in China. And so they've long focused and long prioritized semiconductors because it matters to so many technologies that matter to our national security and to theirs.
Is it safe to say that the world is awash in industrial policies at this point, that you're seeing it really around the world, whether it's the United States or China, something that they've done certainly for a long time, but we're not immune to years ago actually helping out the U.S. semiconductor industry at another time and era, if you will, but we're seeing it in Europe. Is that kind of the way forward that we need to think about, that nations are going to be investing deeply in industrial policy, whether it's for national security concerns or supply chain concerns?
It's a clear trend. I think it was Bloomberg who had crunched some of the numbers and found that about $380 billion by governments have been invested in semiconductors. And that's not only the U.S. and China. Many of our friends and allies are investing in semiconductors, and that's really good news because there are force multipliers in making sure that these add up to our collective security and value. So the EU has a $46 billion plan. South Korea just last week announced that they were going to commit another $19 billion. SK Hynix, one of their leading companies, and so this isn't government investment, but SK Hynix, a leading South Korean company, just announced a big $4 billion investment at Purdue Research Park. It's one of the largest economic development projects in Indiana. We've seen TSMC now up to $65 billion investing in the onshoring here in the United States. And so, yes, governments are investing, but so are companies too. And it speaks to the importance of tech diplomacy. Companies and countries across allies and partners are working together to make sure that we secure this technology.
What would you like to see more in terms of policy, especially when it comes to the semiconductor industry in the United States?
Well, we co-hosted at the Senate last month, the second annual CHIP Summit with Purdue, and we had almost every leading semiconductor company there, many partners and allies from across the world. And the number one thing that we talked about was workforce. And I'll just give you a stat here. There are about 345,000 jobs that the chips industry employs right now. There's going to be another 115,000 by 2030. At the current rate, 60% of those are going to be unfilled. And so we can invest as much as we want to in R&D, in labs, in new fabs, but unless we have the talent to be able to work in those things and advance the semiconductor industry, then it really doesn't matter. And so workforce capacity building that talent pipeline is as equally important as investing dollars.
Michelle, I want to go back to one of the exclusive stories that came from our team, Mackenzie Hawkins and Ian King, earlier this week about the U.S. slowing AI chip exports to the Middle East by NVIDIA and AMD. And they write that part of the concern is that Chinese companies could access these chips through data centers in the Middle East, meaning that they could still use data centers, even if they're not on or in mainland China, because of the ability to access those via the cloud or through partnerships with other countries. Is that a real risk to U.S. national security?
Yeah, I think it goes to show how much that tech companies are just as much in the domain of national security as governments are. And so many of these technologies are cross-cutting and borderless. And so the United States is trying to prioritize national security. We've imposed many export controls and restrictions on these advanced chips going to China. And there might be other ways for them to get it. And so I think the U.S. is being strategic and careful to make sure that those advanced technologies and chips aren't getting in the hands of China, who want to use that to further their military ambitions and the People's Liberation Army. And so I think you see that happening here. And one of the reminders for the business world and for corporates is to remember that they do play a role in national security and our tech security. And we want to make sure, the United States wants to make sure that we're not, as they're doing business across the world, sacrificing long-term security interests for short-term profits.
Middle East, friend or foe of the United States, especially when it comes to high technology?
In many cases, they're proving to want to be a strategic partner, and that's where diplomacy comes into play. We want to make sure that we're working with them as we're partnering on critical technologies to make sure they're advancing our values and our interests. And that means data privacy. It means that they're helping, not harming human rights, that they abide by the rule of law, that they abide and respect intellectual property. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration. There's a large fund in Saudi Arabia, I think just last week, that had said if the U.S. wants them to divest from China, they will. Yeah. And so there's a lot of opportunity for partnership, and the importance of tech diplomacy is going to make sure that when we partner on technology together, it advance our shared interests.
Michelle, just 25 seconds. Can we work things out with China in a better way? I mean, the pandas are coming back to D.C. Panda diplomacy seems to be back. Is that significant, just quickly, in your view?
Pandas have played a key role, it seems, in diplomacy over the long term. Look, I think at the end of the day, the U.S. has been really clear, and many of our partners and allies, like the EU, like the Quad in Asia, on the values that we want to place front and center when it comes to our relationship with China, and specifically on technology. And that's up to China. You know, are they going to make sure that our cooperation on technology advances human rights and intellectual property? Michelle, it's up to them.
We got to run. Thank you. Michelle Giuda of the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. This is Bloomberg.